Thanks so much for joining me. Some of you have already cast a ballot in this year's general election. Others of you are still considering for whom you will vote by November 3rd. In either case, you are exercising both an important civic responsibility as well as satisfying a significant moral obligation. The civic responsibility is self-evident. If you want particular leadership, you must vote. No one can do that for you or instead of you, because in the United States, voting is a right for adult citizens. The moral obligation might be less evident. Redemption, we believe, has both a personal and social dimension. We are not placed within the human community for our sake alone, but, as Pope Francis wrote in Evangelii Gaudium, to desire, seek, and protect the good of others. In other words, you and I are to cooperate with the Holy Spirit in establishing and furthering the common good. Since we believe that voting supports the common good, then as Catholics, we have a serious moral obligation to vote. But before we do that, we need to check in with our conscience. The common misunderstanding is that conscience amounts to what I think on an issue, and nothing could be further from the truth. Conscience is thinking about what is just and true. It is not a partial appraisal based on the words of a preacher, politician, or passionate point of view. The inner moral sense is not built on a sum total of what I think, but is a manifestation linked with truth itself, regardless of my preferences. It is a faculty deep within us that we do not create. It is the law of love inscribed unto each human heart by God, which urges us to do good and avoid evil. You can find that in the Catechism. Our conscience expects us to understand the principles of morality, decide how to apply those principles in specific circumstances, and judge the moral status of concrete acts. That's the Catechism too. It is not pre-programmed, though. This faculty is more than superego or social convention. It is not developed simply by feelings, opinions, circumstances, intentions, or movements. And it does not simply decide for what makes us happy or against what makes us unhappy, but for what is truly good and against what is truly evil. Conscience lines up all our life questions: the nature of marriage, the problem of racism, the concerns about the environment and hunger, the tragedy of abortion, and so many other things, but does not see them as competing events. They are interrelated like siblings. Conscience refuses to let any one of these become a stand-alone issue. Conscience winces when it hears a candidate claim that healthcare can be fixed, but still agrees that a child in the womb can be killed. Conscience knows that if a candidate favors human embryonic stem cell research, which we believe is the killing of a human person, then we are not free of violence. Conscience knows that if you treat the environment any way we like, sooner or later we will need treatment because of the environment. Conscience realizes that if we support torture, we have just paid the deposit for another war 20 years from now. Conscience sees broadly, and every action propelled by a well-formed conscience does not simply change the world, it transforms it. So, how do we form a moral conscience? Here are 9 guidelines to consider. As I walk you through them, think about the issues that concern you, including How do I support immigrants and the sovereignty of my country at the same time? How is it that I condemn abortion while not condemning war and capital punishment and stem cell research? How can I support Christian marriage and my LGBTQ friends who are in committed relationships at the same time? How do I support my family and friends who are victimized by racism and sexism and xenophobia? And the hardest of all right now, how can I make a choice among imperfect candidates, none of whom support everything I believe to be true and moral, while still voting for the advancement of the common good? So Guideline 1, make a habit of studying and trying to understand the scriptures, conciliar documents, papal encyclicals, and the writings of well-respected theologians. Guideline 2, consult with a chaplain or pastor, a campus minister, or a spiritual guide who understands and can explain the church's teaching clearly and correctly. Identify the fundamental truths or values on which church teaching is based and determine how essential this teaching is to the core of our faith. Be very wary of making decisions solely based on information you read in books or online, which may not accurately explain the church's teaching. Guideline 3, pray for the grace to understand and appreciate the underlying truth or values which are reflected in the church's teaching, and for the grace to discern what is possible for you in your particular circumstance. Be patient and allow time for God's inspiration to guide you directly or through others who know you and love you. Guideline 4, even though the church's teaching may seem idealistic, unrealistic, or wrong to you, start from the assumption that it is correct and applies to your personal circumstances. Assume that the church's understanding of God's revelation and human nature is fuller, deeper, and more reliable than any individual's understanding. Guideline 5, evaluate your personal opinions, feelings, and circumstances carefully. If you agree with the church teaching, be grateful, but also assess honestly the reasons why you are unable or unwilling to agree or comply with the church's teaching. This is best done with the assistance of a trusted companion, such as that chaplain or pastor, confessor, or spiritual guide who understands the church's teachings as well as your personal circumstances. Guideline 6, repeat Guideline 2. Consult with your chaplain or pastor, a confessor, or reliable spiritual guide before making a final decision. The goal here is to determine to what extent you can or cannot understand or follow the church's teaching. To what extent is it possible to honor the teaching in part, or to what extent is it possible to honor the underlying truth or value which is reflected in the teaching? Guideline 7, go back to Guideline 3. Continue to pray for the grace to understand or comply with the church's teaching more fully in spite of your personal circumstances. Pray for the grace to appreciate and honor the underlying truth or value reflected in a particular teaching. Be open to changing your decision as your understanding or circumstances change. Guideline 8, consult again with your chaplain or pastor, a confessor, or reliable spiritual guide if you are troubled by your decision. And the last guideline, Remember that God knows you are an imperfect and sinful person, but loves you nonetheless. Trust in God's mercy and God's love, even if after careful discernment your decision does not agree with the Church's teaching. If you decide that you cannot understand or comply completely with the Church's teaching, avoid coming to the conclusion that the Church must be wrong. Although at times prophetic individuals and groups within the Church come to different conclusions which the Church might officially accept at a later date, most of us are not prophets. If you are led by a morally responsible conscience to believe or act in a way which is contrary to what the Church teaches at the present time, continue to assume that the Church is correct and that for more or less legitimate reasons you are unable or unwilling to agree or comply at the present time. Continue to participate as fully as possible in the sacramental and spiritual life of the Catholic Church, being careful not to give scandal to others who may be confused by your belief or behavior. If you are led by a morally responsible conscience to believe or act in a way which is contrary to what the Church teaches at the present time, try to do so with a spirit of respect and humility, a desire to remain in communion with the Catholic faith community, and the intention to believe and obey as fully as possible in what the Church believes and teaches. Then continue to pray and study with great patience, aware of your own limitations and sinfulness, always desiring to be transformed by God's love and mercy. Creating a well-formed conscience is something like creating a work of art. It demands considerable study and consultation, a lifetime of patience, and a lot of humility. But unlike a work of art, which eventually is finished, a well-formed conscience grows and matures and can even change throughout your lifetime. Thanks for listening. This is a lot of information in a very short presentation. The ramifications of these guidelines filled an entire semester of my seminary study, so don't be discouraged if this seems like too much information for a single sitting. Just remember this: consult, study, pray, and then decide. That's the best way to form your conscience. Also, if you have time on Wednesday, October 14th, please join us for a further conversation on this timely topic in the Virtual Redlin Room. All the details can be found on the cornellcatholic.org website. Thanks again for listening.